how you mentioned how pharmaceutical payments that exist in the United States and why that matters. How important is it for Canadians to understand who's funding clinicians, researchers, advocacy groups, and academic centers in this space? Like, how important is that?
I think that transparency, the absence of transparency, is perhaps the single greatest contributor to our current addiction crisis, and the fact that we were able to um, have these really disastrous policies implemented and harms concealed. And so absence of transparency, it cuts across several of our institutions. One is the transparency related to corporate funding. So we need immediately to require pharmaceutical companies, among others, to disclose any funds that they are donating to hospitals, universities, researchers, and clinicians. That's currently not required. It's done voluntarily. So we need to fix that, because we know that have been corporate. We know from the disclosures of groups like the BC Centre on Substance Use that they're receiving monies from pharmaceutical companies because they list them as donors. But we have no idea if that's a complete list, and we have no idea how much and what the money is being used for. So that's essential. We also need transparency around things like research ethics. So one of the things that was done in an attempt to change our laws in Canada, drug laws, was this request that I referred to earlier by a consortium of HIV/AIDS leaders to Health Canada, requesting an exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to operate a drug user co-op and evaluate it using a protocol that had been developed by researchers at UBC. Okay, so Health Canada thinks about this, writes back and says, no, the risks to the public are too great. And by the way, and they put in their letter, if you proceed with this, you will be in violation of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. From their publications, which then came out about 2 years later, it's now clear that they started collecting data on this research 3 days after Health Canada had warned them, don't do it, you're not approved, and if you do it, you'll be violating the law. Okay, 3 days after that, they start collecting data. Brazen. They keep collecting data until the day that they're raided by the Vancouver Police Department, and trafficking charges are brought against the operators. Now, okay, you can't publish research internationally in accredited journals without ethics board approval. How in the world did UBC ethics boards, and there's more than one ethics board involved because there are a few papers, how did they approve research that Health Canada had deemed completely, they couldn't approve it because of the apparent risks? And how could they approve research that was also illegal to conduct? And among the findings, Dan, about 50% of the members of this co-op reported during the study period they experienced at least one non-fatal poisoning, an overdose, and more than half of the co-op members reported passing on drugs to other members of the public who we know nothing about. Listen, I've been on ethics boards. I've had research before ethics boards that was heavily scrutinized and the risks really carefully assessed. I, for the life of me, have no clue how to explain research ethics boards approving these activities, apart from the fact that they bring a lot of cash into the university. And there would be a kind of a halo over the heads of a number of the researchers involved. I'm speculating, right? Because I've written to the Research Ethics Board chairs asking for information about this and been ghosted. So we need to look into that. We also, something that's a little closer to my own area of work, for about 20 years, I had been leading research in BC on everybody who's diagnosed with an addiction and who's involved with our courts and our correctional settings, and then everything else: income assistance, housing and shelter support, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, everything. Over that 20-year span, we published, just a large body of literature and provided reports for different levels of government. And one of the things that we wanted to do was investigate the people that were showing up in the coroner's findings and link their information so that we could see what were the points where they were touching our systems of care or other sectors along the way, and what were sort of the profiles of risk, right? I was told by our provincial health officer in 2017, when I asked first for his support for this, and he said, "Julian, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that because we need to get the message out to the public that everyone is at risk, just like HIV/AIDS." I went to the coroner. Coroner thought about it for a while, got back to me many months later and said, "We've decided that we're only going to release information to the provincial health officer and to the BC CDC, which at the time was run by the deputy provincial health officer." As you know, listeners might not, both of those organizations were led by guys that would go on to establish safe supply companies. We went to.
I'm glad you. Yeah, yeah. No, we will touch on that, and that gets me to. So I'm glad you brought it forward from the HIV/AIDS policy to addiction. I'm glad that you covered that because that was going to be one of my questions. During the committee, you described a revolving door of, but the timeline that you suggested something more organized than that. In 2020, how significant was it that former public health figures and researchers were moving directly into ventures tied to heroin distribution, automated opioid dispensing, and pharmaceutical safe supply development?
I mean, the evidence of coordination is pretty remarkable and extremely strong. The provincial health officer who ran that office for 2 decades, Perry Kendall, had been clearly working with others toward eventually sort of a segue into addiction. So he, around 2017-18, he left his position as provincial health officer. His handpicked successor was one of his former deputies. And he then went into a role leading or co-leading the newly formed BC Centre on Substance Use. Another one of his deputies was still leading the BC Centre for Disease Control. And in 2019, this handpicked successor, Dr. Bonnie Henry, issued a report calling for drug decriminalization and a pharmaceutical supply, safe supply. And then in 2020, the next year, her former boss, Perry, her former colleague, Mark Tyndall, the director of scientific research for BC's major health research funder, the Michael Smith Foundation, and a former prominent AIDS researcher, Dr. Evan Wood, all announced the formation of safe supply companies. There's no way that would happen by chance. There's clearly a coordinated push. In around the same time, others at the BC Centre on Substance Use began developing that consortium I referred to and making the case for drug user co-ops. So there's very clear evidence of a coordinated plan to push this forward. I could point out that part of this is between about 2020 and 2021. The authors, researchers affiliated with the BC Centre on Substance Use began publishing a flurry of papers, 15, that all called for safe supply urgently, must happen. In some cases, they said we need this safe supply across North America, they said. And Dan, not one of these 15 papers presented any results at all related to either the safety or effectiveness of so-called safe supply. They presented results that described samples of people living in poverty with untreated addictions and mental illnesses. They were unemployed, living in squalor, etc. And then they went from that, and they did not recommend effective interventions that treat any of those things, because we have those. and all of them. So there was this, again, clearly an apparent effort to coordinate and flood the journal marketplace, the scientific literature, with this apparent sort of upsurge of support for safe supply. But it's all the same people, all based in BC. So this is like, I guess, hats off for coordinating a plan and executing it. It just so happens it was a terrible plan, and they went about it in a very I just call it bullying way. They did not tolerate any critique. If they did not, they had no interest in debating ideas whatsoever. They were invited to Alberta to the Alberta government's Safe Supply Committee, as was I. And I when I went, I thought, this is great. They're going to have to come, and we're going to hear what they think is the evidence supporting their case. Not one of them agreed to come. They issued these huffy sounding rejection letters. We're not going to dignify your committee with our presence, kind of thing. Well, everybody, like people like me, knew, no, that's not true. You're not coming because you don't have anything. So this is kind of the approach that has been going on, sort of like behind the scenes. A lot of people have known about this, but no one really wants to come out and critique it until recently. Recently, it's become okay because the policies of decrim and safe supply have both been declared by political leaders as failures. So by that essentially makes it okay to say critical things. But for a while, they just kind of took this very heavy-handed approach, and were successful far longer than they should have been.
It's funny that you mention that they produced, papers. At the same point in time, you mentioned papers on your side being asked to be destroyed by the government. Can you take me through that?
Well, yeah. So as I mentioned before, I had tried a few times to gain access to coroner's data because I was pretty sure that the work we had previously published on who's at risk and where are people at risk around BC for severe addictions, I was pretty sure that if we added coroner's data to that we would see some alignment, and we'd see the communities that were already producing people that were repeatedly and for the first time repeatedly involved with courts and corrections. So like after about 2013, there was this trend of people with addictions being more and more likely to be hospitalized involuntarily, and put into correctional centers. So I thought, okay, this is going to help us not only identify risk, but it's going to help us locate where services are needed. And so I tried a few times and was shot down. And then eventually we had a committee that I've been working with for about 20 years, spanning multiple ministries, that we're not high enough up in the government to necessarily see this as politically awkward or opposing what leaders were doing. So they actually signed on, and we submitted an application to the Michael Smith Foundation. We got funding to do this research, and we got an approval from a formal approval from the Ministry of Health, which provides most of our data, renewing our information sharing agreement to conduct this very research. So we had the money, we had the approval. And at that time, I was asked, like within a matter of weeks of getting this approval, I was asked by then Housing Minister David Eby to provide him with a briefing. He had been Attorney General for a number of years, and I knew him in that role. But he asked me to give him a briefing on housing related things, and I did. And then he asked me to brief his deputy ministers, the ones on the social side. And I did that. I did not know at the time that they had already decided what to do. They were going to dramatically expand low barrier housing. They were already bought into the idea of drug decriminalization and safe supply. And my remarks were, I didn't address those specifically because I thought that they were inviting me to give advice in the planning stages. That's how it was framed to me. So I told them what we had found had worked. I also told them what we had found did not work. And I explained to them that we had this approved research in place and that we were going to be doing a careful analysis of the government's policies going forward. Okay. 1 week after that briefing, I received a letter from the provincial government ordering us to destroy all data that we had collected spanning decades, multiple research projects, multiple teams, including international collaborators, doctoral students, research that was collected with the consent of individuals so that we could learn from their experience and hopefully benefit others in similar circumstances. And the order to destroy data also effectively neutralized our ability to do research going forward, which I think was a large part of their reason for acting this way. And we had no backing. When I went to senior leaders in my university, Simon Fraser University, and said, this is crazy. I mean, this is a clear violation of or an order that is forcing us to violate some of our responsibilities as researchers. And I was told that it would be awkward for the university to get involved because there were other institutional priorities, one of which is a medical school, a new medical school at SFU, that involved the same people who were responsible for the order to destroy data. So I had no cover at all. And to me, it really underscored how pervasive networks of influence are, how much they sort of cross-pollinate. And at this point, I knew that when that order was given and ultimately my efforts to resist were unsuccessful, I knew that a day would come when we would have a different government and we could ask to recompile all those data and have a clear understanding of who perished, who did we lose, and what were the characteristics of those people that would help us understand how to prevent similar suffering and loss in the future. So we can still do that work. But for these last 5 years, we've been living with a government in BC that studiously needed to avoid transparency on those very questions.
And that really hurts public trust. Like at the end of the day, it hurts public trust. It undermines, like, let's just say, the people involved had good intentions and there's nothing nefarious. We don't know because there, like you said, there is no transparency. We don't know who's involved. They're gatekeeping the information, like you said. I mean, to me, it looks like it's coordinated gatekeeping. And to see that it discredited, like they discredit your work. Now they've painted a situation where only one side of the story gets told, and that's a disservice to the public as well. You said some of the people criticizing your work were themselves funded through safe supply grants and pharmaceutical money. How much did that shape what media and the public were allowed to hear?
From what I saw, it essentially determined the narrative. They're public servants, so we published documents reviewing international experiences with drug decriminalization, and we conducted a lengthy report on evidence related to so-called safe supply, and we were asked when that was a report that we did for the Ministry of Health in Alberta, and they asked us also to outline what are some other additional interventions with good evidence of effectiveness to reduce risk of fatal drug poisoning. So we did that too. That was actually much of the report. None of that content got into mainstream media. In fact, I don't think much of that content got into any media. What was, the report went in, and I had hoped, because I had collegial relationships up to this point with many of the people involved, even though we had differences of opinion. That's not new. It shouldn't be. It's not new in universities or in academia. and it shouldn't be a major cause for concern. We exist in part to create a space where competing ideas can be heard and digested and assimilated or something. But instead, what happened was, so I was expecting that when we published these findings, and what instead happened were simply attacks. And I then learned that the BC Centre on Substance Use had issued very similar attacks, like cookie cutter attacks against other academics when they did things like, for instance, criticize the overall effectiveness of consumption sites. They had used the exact same rating scale that they used on our document on a review of consumption sites, and effectively bullied those researchers into voluntarily withdrawing their research even after it had been peer reviewed and published. So there's a, you know, it's just a breakdown in the way universities and scholarship is supposed to work. So they held a press conference. Within 2 weeks of our report being finalized, they had got 50 of their colleagues together to sign an open letter lambasting our review. And that's what got picked up by mainstream media. Addiction experts across the country agree that this report by Summers and his colleagues is terrible and not worth reading, right? That was the story. And all of the content, so and effectively, you know, they achieved their objective, I think, because they suppressed any discussion in the public domain of what else might we do, right? So they agreed with our main finding, which was that at the moment, and still today, by the way, there is no evidence to support the safety or effectiveness of providing people with pharmaceuticals as a way of reducing their overall risk, and specifically their drug poisoning risk. There is no evidence to support that claim. And there wasn't when we did our review. But as I said, they achieved the goal of ensuring that the public didn't have any consideration of alternatives. Policymakers, though, definitely read our report, and some in media did. But policymakers that next year from federal, provincial, and territorial governments met in Vancouver a few months after our report came out, and I know because I was here, our report was part of their agenda. So, you know, it did find its way into certain areas of decision making, maybe some of the most important ones. But, you know, it's just remarkable to see how effective this manufacturing of consent, right, operates. It's Chomsky's propaganda model, you know, in action.
I mean, you know, it almost seemed like it wasn't until it was either a policy by David Eby that people could smoke drugs near playgrounds that this became like this hit a flashpoint. Let me ask you a question. When you put all this together, revolving doors, private capital, controlled data access, institutional retaliation, ethic concerns, and media pressure, you know, I mean, to me, it's obvious how addiction policy in British Columbia was actually, you know, how it was synthesized when you put all those pieces together. And it's fair to say that, you know, the public was sold a public health policy, a public health policy that functioned like a system of dependency than a recovery system. You know, why is it so difficult to admit, like for institutions to admit why their policy approach is failing? Is it like because of is it obviously it's politics, because if you admit you failed, you have to take that on the chin. But, you know, and I think that maybe, you know, this goes back to before we were talking on the before we went live about how the Western parliamentary system is actually designed, is that we have these unaccountable gatekeepers like these college boards that are not accountable to the public. Where you look at the United States and they have these systems like where their sheriffs are elected, where their judges are elected, where their district attorneys are elected, and there's serious accountability to the public. Where here it almost seems like there is no accountability, and that we can just keep doubling down on failure. Let me ask you a question. And what should recovery orientated system actually look like in practice for someone struggling with severe addiction, unstable housing, and mental illness? What should that recovery orientated system actually look like?
We went up to people in some of our work and on the streets, in shelters, in court proceedings, and if they didn't have a decent place or were homeless, were struggling with addiction, mental illness, we offered them help. So we offered them what we were supposed to begin doing in the 1980s. And so we had choices of housing. Remember, one of the key elements in two of the key elements in overcoming addiction and other forms of mental illness involve agency, developing self-determination, and assuming responsibility. Two things. So we start right at the beginning. And this grew out of actually harm reduction. Harm reduction, when I started working in the area of harm reduction, we had a literal backpack: water, condoms, needles, syringes, snacks. Can I offer you any of those? So now, 20 years later, when we were doing this work, we had a bigger metaphorical backpack. I've got 3 places that are available today. One in the West End, one in South Vancouver, one not far from here. You interested in looking at any of those? They're all in diverse buildings. I can show you a picture if you want. And so, or we could go and get a meal. And these places come with a team. So it is kind of a package deal. If you want to look at any of these places and you decide one is right for you, there's going to be a team that is going to be there to support you, make sure that you can transition into that place and call it your own and make it stick. So, do I have to stop taking drugs? No, you don't have to stop taking drugs, right? Just like harm reduction. First things first, we need to get some responsibilities into your life, some things that are worth you defending. And about a quarter of the people we worked with had kids under age 18 that they were separated from. Almost all those people before long started to think, geez, this could be the point in time where I could invite them to see me again, right? And so really power and resuming work was a major priority for almost everybody, paid work. So we can do things like that. And the results from our randomized trial using these administrative data, so data that we receive from the justice system, from the healthcare system, they're relatively complete. In our world, those are relatively complete inventories of data. Crime went down 71% compared to the people in usual care, and 45% fewer medical emergencies than people in usual care. The people that were randomized to all live together with rich supports in the building were no different in terms of crime and medical emergencies, statistically, from the people that were in usual care. And the simple answer is that the culture of the building was formed by the culture of the street. We just moved it inside. Whereas the culture in these intact buildings was as diverse as any apartment that we might live in. So those are things we can do. People choose when internationally research has been done asking what kind of housing would you like to have. Overwhelmingly, it's independent housing, such as we provided. So one of the things we need to pivot away from is this tendency, which we're still doing, of congregating people all together in relatively low barrier buildings where essentially they're monitored. Like a sort of a wellness check around their drug use, but that's about it. And the climb down, as you said, for policymakers is, I think, made quite a bit more difficult because of the misuses of power that have already been engaged in to get us to this point. These are in many cases, I know from my prior relationships with these individuals that they're prideful people. They think about legacy. They think about their reputations. And it's one thing if these policies had all turned out and deaths went down, and things got a lot better. And then questions about, like potential conflicts of interest and so on might even seem churlish, right? But the fact that it did not go that way, and in my view was never ever capable of going that way, and then they doubled down with things like I don't know how to explain the ethics board approvals, like that makes no sense to me. I don't know how to explain the industry funding directly, and its role influencing these policies, but the people involved do. And I think that they've continued to sort of double down and resist acknowledging errors, in part because that opens the door to their own complicity in creating this crisis. So, I'm afraid in BC, I'm with the people in the legislature that are calling for a public inquiry. I think that the people responsible for making mistakes are so far not at all likely to admit any kind of wrongdoing or any kind of error. The problem is that then leaves the institutions that they lead and are part of unchanged. That can't work. We do need to change our policies, obviously, but if we change our policies without affecting the institutions that must implement them, that's like changing direction in our boat without addressing the fact that we've got a leak. We absolutely need to, and a point you raised, we need to understand what happened and what's going to be different in order to reestablish public trust in our institutions. So it's a bit of that complicates things, obviously. But again, the good news is that we have not only evidence from the past, but we have evidence now looking across the country. There are clear indications of progress in Alberta. Concerns that people had when policies began being changed in Ontario are not panning out. So we've got a wealth of evidence to build on, and we should here in BC be contributing to that fund of evidence. We are in a really difficult spot right now, a very tense spot right now.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that, I subscribe to the belief that when large groups of humans get together, we default to incompetence. Unless we have a shared value, which is why I think religions are so successful. And again, when you describe Mao and his transition, again, there was a shared belief, people believing in something higher than them. So I think that when large groups of people, unless they don't have a shared, or unless they have a shared belief, they default to incompetence. And I think that that's true especially true with governments. And when you describe the institution, you also have all these mini stakeholders that are entrenched in their beliefs. So it's not just one person. It almost seems like the whole system needs a revamp. But the problem is, and I think this is what you're describing, is that we have one system, but we need to kind of slowly have another system in place. We can't just drop the one system out without having this other system. We need to slowly transition. And we need to have politicians and policymakers that are brave enough to do this, to stand up to these institutions, these stakeholders, these NGOs, and say, look, we're still funding your system, but we're going to try this. And I think that we need to try something else, because obviously the system that we have is just not working. Dr. Summers, I really do appreciate you, spending the last hour and a half with us. Where can people find you?
There's still some work published on Karma's website. The center has been closed by my university, but CARMHA, Karma, has some reports, and if people are interested in sort of further, like what could we do better, there's a call to action that I put together with about 12 not-for-profit organizations, and it builds on a lot of our research over the years. It was submitted to the government a few years ago. We didn't hear back at all, not a peep. But that's there as sort of an example of what we could do differently. And I'm active on X. People can follow me there. So those are, and there's quite a bit on YouTube. Just
We'll have all those links. We'll have all those links down below.
Awesome.
Dr. Somers, thank you so much for spending the last hour and a half with us.
Dan,
I hope
thanks so
to
much
have
for
you
your
again.
reporting, like over time, and also for the opportunity to chat. It's been great.
Oh, absolutely. I hope to have you again. I think that we haven't seen the last of this debate, and I think it's ongoing, and I hope